So we're currently looking at the third of John's responses to the success that he experiences, and it's the challenge of truth, the challenge of staying on message, because we've seen that it's so easy to be distracted from the main message of Christianity. It's very easy in church life to get distracted by programs, to be distracted by budgets, to be distracted by buildings, to be distracted by people, to be distracted by music, to be distracted by teas and coffees and refreshments. There's all sorts of things that can distract us from what we're really called to. And often in our society today, we live in a very consumerist society. We live in a society that says it's all about me. Did you know that the sun revolves around me? I am the centre of the universe. And actually we then begin to experience a real shock and get really angry and upset when we discover that the world doesn't revolve around us. Actually, we're just part of the wider picture, a wider society. And in church, if we're not careful, we take that consumer mentality into church. But rather than being disciples, we're consumers. Church isn't doing it for me. I don't feel it. We're not doing what I would want in church. And so, we find ourselves seeing people move to find different churches because church isn't doing what we want it to do. And sometimes we see that we approach church as it being about feeding me, rather than, if we're mature disciples, we should recognise that we've actually grown past baby food onto solid food and can actually learn to feed ourselves. So suddenly church doesn't become about meeting my needs, but actually I'm part of the body that's there for the purposes of God, to help other people come into a living relationship. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't come together as believers. We're called to not give up meeting together. We need to come together to worship God. If nothing else, we need to come and acknowledge who he is and give him that adulation that he deserves. But also we need to come together so that we can be strengthened. If you take a burning coal out of the fire and leave it on the hearth, it goes cold, and we need to come together so that we can iron sharpen iron and help each other to become stronger. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't have church and shouldn't see church as a way of strengthening each other or worshipping God. But actually, when it becomes about performance or consumerism, rather than being about discipleship, we're on dangerous ground. The picture John the Baptist gives us in verse 17 is of this sifting, this separating of the useful from the useless. And there are two outcomes of the sifting. The first outcome is that the wheat or the grain is gathered into the barn. This, for us, should give us a picture of acceptance. It should tell us that the grain is wanted, it's needed, it's chosen, and it's gathered. And for us as believers, if we are identified with that grain, if we've been sifted and tested and the chaff blown away, what's left is useful, it's wanted, it's needed, and it gives us a sense of acceptance. We can find our identity within the family of disciples. One grain of wheat on its own has little effect, but a barn full of grain can feed people for years. There's a sense of the collective nature of the grains being gathered together, and this value comes from a combined approach. The grain in the barn is a picture of resources. It can feed people and be turned into food. It's a picture of value. It can be traded and sold. And it's a picture of being stored. It's a picture of future potential. So what we have here when we're seeing the grain gathered into the barn is a picture of acceptance and a picture of potential. It's a picture of the family of God, of an acceptance of an eternal destiny. Jesus said he was going to prepare a place in the Father's house for his disciples, and he would come back. And that's why it's so dangerous when sometimes we see this bit of an independent spirit, where people say, I don't need to go to church, I don't need to be part of the church. That independent spirit is not a picture of what we see of the grain. There is a power in the collective nature of discipleship, of the power of church together. That was God's design, the ecclesia, the church coming together. If you were sifted, would you be found in the barn or blown out into the field with the chaff? John the Baptist avoided the challenge of success by staying focused and staying on message. And that message is about knowing our salvation and being part of the family of God. Are you part of the family of God?